Hey everyone, Scott here to discuss Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, starring Robert De Niro, Kenneth Branagh, Thomas Hulse, and Helena Bonham Carter, directed by Kenneth Branagh. Now, I've heard a lot of stories about this troubled production, but will it be a good movie? Well, let's get into this and find out, since I've never seen this movie before. We open with the narration of Mary Shelley telling us the horrifying story of Frankenstein and his monster, which has so far not been too horrifying as we start in the Arctic Sea and the stormy night as something hits a ship and kills a few men, and that scene was very confusing as we move on to men breaking some ice to get to the North Pole as they encounter Victor Frankenstein, played by Kenneth Branagh, with his sled dogs and his monster, played by Robert De Niro, following behind and kills his sled dogs, which makes me alienate your movie from the get-go. And I'm already 5 minutes into it, and we go back to Geneva in 1773, when Victor was a kid, as he's introduced to his new roommate Elizabeth Lavenza, as she's Victor's new sister as an adult, and as an adult, who is played by Helena Bonham Carter, as it's thus far confusing, alienating from the get-go. Victor's mother is pregnant, and I don't get how, and she tries to give birth, but she dies while the body lives, and 3 years later, Victor visits her grave, and the death of his mother happens when Victor was an adult. And this timeline confused the fuck out of me. For example, Victor, Elizabeth, and Justine test the electricity from the sky and get briefly sparkly fingers, which is weird enough as it is. And we move on to a dance as they celebrate Victor with his father, played by Ian Holm. And what are they celebrating exactly? The fact that Victor has caught electricity, or his engagement to Elizabeth, which will come later? Because remember, they're brother and sister. Or is it Victor going to school and to study resurrection? Or something. I don't really know. And I get the impression it's the third one, because what is this supposed to be about? Victor resurrecting a dead body while he proposes his hand in marriage to Elizabeth, and their chemistry falls flat, as it could have worked for another movie. Victor gets to school and where he learns how to resurrect people as it's God's work, and Victor wants to do the same thing, which is a fantastical thing, as he believes in doing in science, while Victor is getting picked up on by other men about his theories, and they talk about illegal experiments that Victor got in trouble for, and Victor is in surgical class while he writing to Elizabeth, Justine, and his father and family at home, and Victor argues about wanting to bring a dead body back to life, and Professor Krempe brings him to a place where he has to find a way to resurrect a man, and I don't care for the characters, as I don't know who any of them are, which is really sad. Victor wants to resurrect the body and look for a victim, and they find one in a man whom is a sharp-featured man who is killed in the very scene and will turn into the creature later in the movie. And the problem I have is I don't believe Robert De Niro as Frankenstein's monster, as here's a guy who's from New York, pulling off the monster with his New York accent, as I don't buy it whatsoever. Meanwhile, Elizabeth is worried about Victor not writing for months as she goes to him to see if everything's alright, while he focuses on resurrection and frogs, for example, as he stitches up a body to use the same technique as the frog. And I don't like this version of Frankenstein, as it pulls off some unconvincing choices. Elizabeth visits Victor and wants to help Victor with his project while he's an academic outside, or whatever the word is, and he talks to her into leaving him in epidemic. I think that's the word. And saying how much he loves her while she leaves rather upset, as Victor is about to pull off the resurrection of the creature as it's alive, and I found myself utterly bored. And I was falling asleep the first time I watched this movie, and this is a mess of a movie after studying it. Victor wakes up and sees the monster going after him as Victor tries to kill it, but it runs out of captivity into the town as he disguises himself until he smells the food and gets chased after and is cornered and beats up by on the townspeople, and suddenly runs away and continues to hide from people while Victor rests and confesses he did something terrible, like letting a monster become alive as he's home and sees Elizabeth playing the piano. And they smooch up a storm like a couple of wolves, which was a terrible. And this movie is so far pretty terrible. And this may be the least favorite Frankenstein movie yet to date, in my opinion, anyways. The monster goes into a barn and makes himself at home, like in a couple of the movies I've reviewed before, and watches a couple of farmers being in love and pulling some crops as they have a family and see the crops and will have enough food for the winter, and watches them for a while as he becomes friends with the blind man, like in the other movies I reviewed before. And a friend of Victor and Elizabeth learn they're engaged to be married and asks him to be his best man, and he accepts while the creature reads the journal of Victor Frankenstein as they're approached by a bad man, and the monster saved the blind man's life. And that's when their friendship begins, as this felt more predictable than the previous times I've seen this story. The monster gets forced out of the barn and is frightened and reads more of the book from Victor, saying he's a monster and will get his revenge on Victor. And Elizabeth stops by the Frankenstein's house to try on some wedding dresses while the little brother Willie sees the monster, and it learns he's with Frankenstein, and goes missing, and I get the impression he's killed, while Victor and his friend arrive at the castle and eventually find Willie dead by the monster. And once again, it's very alienating for the movie, and it's just too long, as I felt the 2 hours and 3 minutes of it. The monster encounters Victor at the castle, and wants to meet it at the mountains. And next day comes, and Victor looks for the monster in the snow mountains, and the monster tries to attack and kill him, but they get buried, and it talks with him, and it wants someone to love him, like a bride, for example. And the exchange between Branagh and De Niro was pretty damn flat. Like I said, I don't buy De Niro as a monster because he has a New York accent, but he's better off in movies like Goodfellas and Meet the Parents, which is a series I'm going to do later this year leading up to Fokker-in-Law when that thing comes out. Elizabeth is upset with Victor because of the monster's request and wants to leave the castle, while Victor has to make another monster for the monster as he chooses not to, and he threatens Victor, and Victor talks Elizabeth out of leaving the house, but telling her the truth about what the fuck is happening, as she stays with Victor and wants to marry him ASAP so they can face anything together as they get married. And the cinematography was dreadful. This whole movie as they go after the monster, as he kills Victor's father while hunting for the monster, as they get to a sheltered place on their wedding night and have sexual intercourse. And at this point I could care less, as I was sort of checked out of the movie. Victor and Elizabeth hear a piece of music warning saying the monster is here, and it's in the sheltered place, with Elizabeth after Victor leaves the building, and the monster rips her heart out and kills Elizabeth. And Victor brings her home and resurrects her as the bride of Frankenstein as she awakens, and he begs her to say his name. And they dance together until the monster comes in, leading to believe she's for him. And he continues to beg her to say his name until she comes up to the monster and realizes she remembers Victor's name, and they fight over who gets to keep her, and she runs away and burns herself as well as the house. As we go back to the opening of the movie near the North Pole, as Victor dies after explaining his story, and the monster is there with him, and it explains Victor was with his father, and the ship has a memorial service for Victor while the ice breaks apart. And the crew continued to the North Pole while the monster goes on its own way, and with some wood, and they can make a boat of some kind and burns itself to death. And the climax was absolutely dreadful. But how dreadful was this movie? Let's begin with the rating. I'll give this movie a 2.5 out of 10. It was very confusing at times, to a point I don't understand what the fuck is going on here and there. And I already alienated the movie 5 minutes into it for killing a sled dog, and it's confusing and alienating from the get go, while the timeline confused the fuck out of me. And the chemistry between Victor and Elizabeth falls flat, as it could have worked out for another movie, as I don't care for the characters and I don't know who any of them are, which is really sad. I don't buy Robert De Niro as Frankenstein's monster because here's a guy from New York playing a monster with his New York accent, which didn't come off believable to me as a monster. And I didn't like the version of Frankenstein as it pulls off some unconvincing choices, and I found myself utterly bored. As I was falling asleep the first time I watched the movie for the show, and this is a mess of a movie. The movie is pretty terrible, as this may be my least favorite Frankenstein movie yet to date. And this is another solid non-recommendation for this movie, as the friendship between the monster and the blind man felt predictable this time, unlike when I've seen this story before. And it's too long, as I felt the 2 hours and 3 minute runtime of the movie, which is super unfortunate, as this movie was dreadful. So I'd like to thank you guys for joining me, and I will be back with The Bride, since I've already reviewed Guillermo del Toro's Frankenstein. I'll watch that in spirit leading up to the Oscars. And in the meantime, I'll be back with The Bride. And until then, until death do us part.